So the Sega Saturn is one of my favorite systems, and I've done a lot of videos on the console on this channel, but there's always one thing I see a lot in the comment section, and that is how it is very expensive to collect for. I've actually done a video talking about just why the Sega Saturn is so expensive to collect for. So a lot of people don't get into the system, which is a shame because emulation on it isn't that great. You can emulate most of the games, but still, it's fun to play on your CRT TV, just kick back with the controller in your hand and experience what the Sega Saturn offered in the mid-90s. So let's say you're just getting into Sega Saturn collecting. Let's say you came across a Sega Saturn console for cheap, which is pretty common. The system itself doesn't really cost all that much. You could get them for about 50 bucks. I mean, what's 50 bucks when you're talking about a brand new system to add to your collection? So you want to get some games for it, but you don't want to break the bank because the Sega Saturn will break your bank account. What games should you check out? What are some of the must-own but cheap games on the Sega Saturn? Well, that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm going to talk about 5 must-own cheap Sega Saturn games that'll beef up your collection, give you a lot of fun, and really show you what the Sega Saturn could offer in the mid-90s. So, without any further ado, let's get into the games. So the first game I want to talk about is arguably one of the best games on the Sega Saturn and arguably one of the cheapest games on the Sega Saturn, and that is Virtua Fighter 2. Now, if you're not familiar with the Virtua Fighter series, it is a 3D fighter that on the surface looks pretty simplistic and plain, but it's actually a very deep game. There's over 700 moves across all of the characters in this game, and it's really just an amazing fighting game. This is when Sega was pretty much at their prime, I feel, when it comes to arcade games and home console games, and Virtua Fighter 2 is the proof of that. The Sega Saturn version is a great port of the arcade version, and it's still a very fun game to play today. All the characters really feel unique. You don't have any of those clone sort of characters. The visuals look amazing still to this day, and it's just a very fun, deep fighting game that if you want to learn how to master, you'll put in a lot of hours into it. And it's on this list because it is a super cheap game. You can get a loose disc-only copy of this game commonly for $5 or less on eBay all day, every day. And considering it's one of the best Sega Saturn games, period, this game definitely needs to be in your collection. It's a super fun and super cheap game that I highly recommend. The next game I want to talk about is yet another Sega Saturn arcade port, and it might not be as good of a port as Virtua Fighter 2 was because yes, it was a rushed game, but it's still a fun game, I feel, and it's a game that I play a lot, and that is Daytona USA. Now, Daytona USA is a fast-paced arcade racing game, and like I said, the Saturn version isn't nearly as good as the arcade version, but it's still a lot of fun. The racing feel is still there, albeit with, less frames per second, and it's still a good game though. The soundtrack is really timeless. It has those cheesy Sega tunes from that mid-90s era that, games like Sonic R had, and it's just a fun, solid arcade racing game. And once again, another super cheap game, $5 or less for a disc-only copy. Highly recommended, as you'll get a lot of fun out of Daytona USA. Now, when the Saturn and the PlayStation came out, a lot of these companies were going for 3D games, 3D action adventure games, 3D platforming games. But there was a 2D platformer, well, 2.5D, I guess, platformer that really stuck out and I don't think enough people appreciate or talk about, and that's Pandemonium. This game has a really interesting visual style. Like I mentioned, it's a 2.5D game, meaning you play on a 2D plane, but the environments are 3D polygons. And it's a really fun, solid platformer game. There wasn't a lot of 2D platformers at the time during when this game was released, so I feel it was overlooked. I feel people just wrote it off, and they really shouldn't have. The visuals are really nice. The music is sort of a medieval sort of soundtrack, and I really just enjoyed this game. Once again, it's another cheap game. It's about $10 for a loose copy on eBay. So Pandemonium is a game that you should definitely check out if you're just getting into Saturn collecting, as it's a good game on a budget. If you played the Sega Genesis, more than likely you played a game called Landstalker, which was sort of a Zelda-esque game that took place in an isometric view, definitely that action-adventure game with RPG elements, and it was a really fun game. Well, there was a game called Dark Saviour that came out on the Sega Saturn that has that same sort of visual style and was actually marketed originally as sort of a sequel to Landstalker, but it really wasn't. The story didn't have anything to do with the Landstalker game or Time Stalkers, but Dark Saviour is still a really good game. It still looks really good. The gameplay is really solid. It's fast-paced, the action is fast, and I really like the visual style they used in this game. A lot of games from this time frame that were 3D based sort of just look archaic and unplayable, but this game has a really good art style that still makes it very playable till today. It's a good value game. It's about 20 bucks for a loose copy, but it's a game that you'll put a lot of hours into as it has a pretty deep story. So Dark Saviour, a definite must own. One of the best things about the Sega Saturn was just how good it did 2D fighting games, and Street Fighter Alpha is an amazing fighting game on the Sega Saturn. It's everything a fighting game should be, especially a 2D fighter. It's fast, it has flash, it's got a lot of great visuals, it has a good soundtrack, and most importantly, it is butter smooth in terms of gameplay. This pretty much is the arcade port plus loading times, and Street Fighter Alpha is one of those 2D Capcom fighters that you could play until the end of time and never really get bored with it. It's a super fun game. The roster is a little bit limited, but considering you could pick up a loose copy for under $20 on eBay, it's definitely a game worth investing in. If you're a fan of Capcom fighters or 2D fighters in general, it's a game that you'll play for a long time, and it plays best on the Sega Saturn, especially when you compare it to the PlayStation version of the game. So if you're a fan of 2D fighting games, Street Fighter Alpha, go ahead and pick it up. You'll thank me later.
And those are just a handful of the cheap Sega Saturn games that you can pick up. Like I said, these are only disc-only prices, but still, complete in box, it's not that much more. You could get all of these games for well under $100, and you're pretty much getting a solid library of games. You know, a little fighting games, a little action adventure, some platforming, something for everyone in this list, I feel. So let me know what you think about these games in the comments section down below. If there's some cheap games that you would have added to the list, maybe I'll do a follow-up video on this one day. And thank you for checking out this video. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe. I'm doing lots of Sega stuff recently. Hit that like button, leave me a comment, let me know what you think about the video in the comments section down below, and I will catch you guys next time. Later.
RGT 885, RGT 885, RGT